Welcome to this episode of the Legal Paige podcast. Today is all about the legalities of podcasting. How on point with being a podcaster myself and lawyer. And I'm going to talk about why it's so important to make sure your podcast is legal and how that legality portion of your podcast can make or break your business. I am bringing on podcast producer Haylee Gaffin to chat with us more on this subject. And Haylee is a photographer and podcast producer for creative entrepreneurs. She is the owner of Gaffin Creative LLC, and she decided that rather niching down to one service, she'd niche down to one target market by blending her love of photography and podcasting to serve many different creative entrepreneurs. And Haylee runs and manages a lot of different podcasts that are out there. She is not my podcast manager, but Haylee and I have crossed paths before in the online space. She actually manages a lot of my friends' podcasts. And Haylee and I kind of had a situation pop up, and we don't need, I don't need to get into it. And of course, for confidentiality purposes, we're not going to hear, especially in my intro to this episode. But when her and I got to talking about this, we both sat back and we were like, you like podcasts? I like podcasts. I know a bunch of legal stuff about this. And she does a lot of workflow and podcast guest agreements and sending that stuff out for her clients. She has a lot of background knowledge and stories behind don't do this. This was a learning lesson for us. And so I asked Haylee to be on this episode. And I don't say this very often. Maybe I'm like, oh, this is a good episode, but it may not be one of my favorites. I'm never going to, actually divulge that to you all. Guess what? This is one of my favorite episodes we have ever recorded. I had so much fun talking to her. A lot of things came up for me. I've been a guest on many different podcasts, and I started recalling situations that kind of were sticky. I've had lots of podcasts that never sent me a guest agreement. There's things you have to consider copyright-wise, trademark-wise, guest agreement-wise, and just, pulling episodes, editing episodes. It can be an uphill battle if you don't have your legal ducks in a row with your podcast from the get-go. So that is what we intend to do with this episode. And I really hope you gain a lot of insight and knowledge if you are a podcaster or you're interested in starting a podcast. So let's do this. You're listening to the Legal Paige podcast, where we chat about life and business with a legal twist. I'm Paige, attorney and photographer helping online businesses and creatives tackle their business dreams without breaking out in hives. No more legal mumbo jumbo. This podcast features simple, bite-sized advice that'll have you legally legit in no time. Are you ready? Let's get started. Hey, everyone. Thanks again so much for tuning in today. I am so excited that Haylee Gaffin is here to talk all about the importance of making sure your podcast is legal and inclusive with yours truly. I will offer, of course, some legal tidbits and information for all of you podcasters out there. I know Haylee, but Haylee, I would love for you to introduce yourself to all the legal pagers listening.
Hi, thank you so much, Paige. I'm really excited to be here, and just thank you so much for having me on your show. My name's Haylee Gaffin, and I own Gaffin Creative, which is a podcast production company and photography studio located in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I spent years and years in the advertising agency world and then went to corporate world and side hustled my photography business until I found the love of podcasts that I've come to have today. So I'm really excited to talk about all things podcasting and especially getting them legal.
Yeah, me too. Haylee and I connected through a mutual friend. Haylee, I think you run her podcast. Is that correct?
Yes, I do.
So we won't name her, but Haylee and I were kind of talking back and forth, and I was like, oh, she runs a podcast, like she runs a bunch of other podcasts. I think this would be a great person to bring on the show and really just kind of talk about some things that can occur that we all need to be aware of beforehand. And really, you guys know my heart behind the Legal Paige podcast is always just to really give you the information, education, and knowledge that you need to just be a little bit more protected as a business owner, so that we're not backpedaling later on when those situations occur. So Haylee, thanks again so much for your time here on the podcast. I want to start off with really the top legal thing that people forget about when it comes to podcasting, and that is a podcast guest agreement. So I know you've probably run into this as a producer, but it's really all about who owns the podcast episode once it's recorded and aired.
Yes.
So people are saying things right inside the episode, and I'm sure people are thinking, well, just automatically the host owns it, the owner of the podcast. And what if you have a guest? So like Haylee here today, her name, her likeness, her voice, of course, in the actual episode, things that she's saying, does Haylee automatically own those? So my legal answer is, and the big thing that I hope you take away from this episode is yes, copyright ownership lands in the person who fixes, whatever they have, all of their ideas, their expressions in a tangible medium. And so here, Haylee is fixing that in podcast form and audio format. And so her name that she's talking about, her brand that she's talking about, her business, and everything that she's conveying on this episode would be owned by Haylee unless they assign those copyright ownerships over to your podcast. So the big thing is you want to ensure that they sign some type of release. And usually it's going to be very simple. Haylee, once I kind of talk through this, I'd love to hear if you have implemented this with some of the podcasts you work with and kind of the best way to go about this. And then you and I could maybe talk also, I think would be cool about, oh gosh, what if I haven't done this, right? Because there's probably people that are tuning in right now that are like, oh, Paige, I'm not sure if I did that correctly the past 2 years of my podcast. But you guys, you want this to be a very simple, like 1-pager document, probably not more than 2. Don't be overbearing here. I think it's totally fine to do this in like Google Forms or just like a simple online, CRM software where they can sign an agreement. You don't want to make it too lengthy where they're like, oh my God, what are they taking from me? Like, I'm just trying to be a guest on their podcast kind of thing. But a release is just going to outline that in exchange for some type of compensation, right? There always has to be a quid pro quo with contracts. Usually it's not monetary with podcasts, right? We're usually doing some type of publicity or we're sharing them. We're linking all of their resources that they have. Like oftentimes, Haylee could probably talk about this. Lots of people are trying to grow kind of education platforms at the beginning through getting on podcasts. That's something I definitely did at the beginning of the legal page. It's just getting my name out there. And I always had opt-ins so I could get people on my email list kind of thing. And all of those, of course, those actual opt-ins would be owned by the guest. But you want in your podcast release to basically explain, like, in exchange for us publishing you to our audience and on social media and on our website, that we have the right to use your voice and all of the info that you're going to share in the podcast. And in most states, you can also do this just by kind of like an email back and forth. That's something people ask me too. I mean, you guys know I'm all about a 4-cornered agreement. I think it's way better to be able to enforce later on. You can really lay out the terms in very simple, legal, plain language in your contract. I just like sentence by sentence. But the one thing I wanted to add in here before Haylee chimes in is, if you just want to do something not so crazy at the beginning, that's totally fine. And in most states, this will be A-okay. Just probably double check with your lawyer. But you can always just say, hey, heads up, and I want your approval on this. I just want to make sure that I have your permission to use your name, likeness, voice, and any info that you share in our episode together. And that when we post it, like on our social media and on our websites, you're going to be okay with that, and that you understand that we have listeners in the US, probably throughout the entire world. They will be able to hear it. And we both agree that my business, which is X, probably state that in the email, is the owner to this podcast episode and the rights to all of this content. And then also I would add in like a little sentence that just says, also, just so we're both clear, how my process works is we usually have the final say to all of the editing in the podcast. Is this okay with you? And then if they just send back an email that's like, yeah, sounds good, I agree, that's perfect too. So there's multiple ways to do this. I always suggest kind of a little bit more formal. It also makes your podcast workflow look more professional. But if you do want to do it a little bit more colloquial, that's fine as well. So Haylee, any info that you have on that and kind of how your podcast that you work for do this in their workflow?
Absolutely. So when I get started with podcasters, they typically are brand new, just starting out and they don't have a ton of experience in the podcasting world, which also means that their budget is tight in comparison to what they would look at for their overall business. So a lot of times they can't afford to hire a lawyer first thing. And so I have been over the last few months driving people to your contract and agreement, but a lot of my clients are having their friends come on their podcasts in the beginning, which I can understand, like not necessarily wanting a contract with them or an agreement with them, but at the same time, you never know what could happen. You never know what conversations are going to happen outside of your podcast. You never know what is going on in the world with certain episodes or topics that you may want to end up pulling the episode, or they may want to end up pulling the episode. And if you don't have an agreement there that says that you can pull the episode, then you're out of luck.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you were talking, I was like, oh gosh, Friends is like, we all think everything's going to be fine.
Right.
Which it usually is, right? We all have the best of intentions. I'm always here to be like, yes, I've had tons of friends on my podcast and usually everything is totally fine. I've never had an issue, but God forbid I did I cover myself in the beginning? So if you're not wanting to be like, here's a huge contract to sign, send that like little email that I just explained. And one of the reasons why is friends are going to be the ones that actually come back and say, hey, can we actually edit this? I didn't really like how I sounded there. Or it kind of sounded like I didn't know what I was talking about, blah, blah, blah. Like they're going to be the ones that are most nitpicky about the back end of the editing of the podcast. So that is definitely something that I would make sure that you just explain to them and have them kind of say, I agree, in an email exchange back and forth. Even a text exchange could work. Just snapshot that for some proof and evidence. And then the one thing I also wanted to say here, Haylee, because you mentioned it on pulling podcast episodes, that's a biggie in the legal world. And it kind of basically triggers legal dispute, essentially, is there are instances for all of you tuning in that are appropriate for you to go outside of your contract with them, right? If you say, well, I own the final rights to the editing, my podcast, and my business owns the rights to the episode. No, we're not going to pull it. Like that would be, of course, best case scenario. But if you want to be kind to your friends, if there's something that happened on their end, maybe if their business is shutting down, right, and they don't want people to be able to find them from anywhere else, that's a different scenario where maybe there's ways that you can work with certain things in your podcast and make sure, there's no sponsorships involved. And there's nothing like link wise that would be like at issue really with that specific episode. And there are situations where you can pull episodes, of course, and you can edit certain things in an episode. I've even had some things where I've said something legally and then maybe it like changed or there was something nuanced that I would prefer to have edited a bit more in an episode. And for me in particular, since I'm a professional and giving, actual legal advice and information, I have always had podcasters be very, very helpful with that. And they'll say, totally, I understand. Like, I'm not trying to be nitpicky, but if I'm like re-recording something and sending it to them, usually they'll do it. So like I said, there's always like a different scenario that could occur. But for the most part, you want to own the episode. You want to own kind of the rights to it, distribution, the right to pull or not to pull an episode. Haylee, I think you also have a recent experience that you had with pulling an episode. Can you kind of explain that to everyone?
Yes, there's a couple of stories I want to share in relation to a couple of things you said, but the first is the pulling of an episode after it aired. It was a same day pull. So it went up, released, and someone listened to the episode, didn't like how they were portrayed because they were mentioned in the episode. And we were requested by them and then by the guest to pull the episode because she didn't want anything bad out there. And in that case, like, if you are going to end up burning a bridge by not pulling an episode, in my opinion, it's better to pull an episode.
Mm-hmm.
I also think this is where having your content batched, so that if you are one of those people that you say, I am releasing an episode every single Wednesday, and you don't want to fall off of that, have an episode you can throw up on top of it. So pulling one and then throwing another one up immediately is something that I do encourage my clients to do if they are dealing with that, because then they have someone come in and say like, oh, well, where is your episode for today? And who wants to explain what happened?
Yeah. That's actually a really good scenario too. Legally, I'm sure people are thinking like, what would you do then? I think one of the big takeaways there is your podcast manager, your editor, you always need to have on high alert for listening to it and seeing if you mention someone else in an episode, or you're mentioning even like the likeness of another business is what I'm thinking here, or the way that they, I don't know, did something. Yeah, fair use can be at play. I'm just kind of going through my legal file folder in my brain here on just some issues I could see, right? Like, what are their claims against your podcast? And that's probably what it's going to be like. Obviously, it wasn't fair use. You're portraying us in a bad light. Maybe some defamation things happening here. And like what Haylee's saying is just really generally speaking, like, how do you want your podcast to be portrayed, right? Is it probably the best option for you to keep that up? Probably not. But I'm thinking if you do have that scenario, probably if you are batch recording and you're doing things in advance, there's so many benefits to that, right? But the legal benefit to that is your podcast manager and your editor will probably catch that if you have that as kind of a checklist for them every time they're reviewing episodes before they go out. And then you could always send that to the person and get approval before airing. That's probably what I would do. And it can be simple. It can just be through an email exchange. That's totally fine. They don't really need to sign anything as long as they're agreeing to it via email. But yeah, I think that's probably the answer to that solution. Before you get into any legal trouble and they come back and like send you a cease and desist. But you guys didn't have that situation, right? It was just, let's take it down. Let's put up another episode. So what was your other story? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So there's two other situations that I run into very often. And one you had mentioned where a lot of your friends will come back and say, hey, can you edit this down? I said this the weird way, or I misspoke and gave you the wrong link, or anything that would need to be, cleaned up in post-production. And that's something that I deal with a lot of. Either I'm going back to a guest and saying, hey, I noticed that you said this. I don't know that this is what you meant. Do you mind if I clean this up and make you sound like what you were trying to say? Because a lot of people, especially new to the podcasting world or new to interviews, get really flustered. And I still to this day, like, get that way, even though I spend, 30 hours a week working on podcasts, I still get nervous, or whatever you want to call it. And I'll say something that I probably don't actually mean. And I'm like, oh, I really hope they clean that up because I said it wrong. And so that's one thing that happens. But then another thing is like, you had mentioned a business going out of business. And that's something that I've done with old episodes, like 2 and 3 year old episodes that people are still finding to this day, because that's the nice thing about podcasts is they're evergreen and they can go back and be listened to 3 years after publish date. And that business could be out of business, but we've recommended them on the podcast. And I've had hosts go in and record an intro that says, hey, since this podcast episode has aired, this business has since shut down. Here's an additional episode you should go listen to if you're listening to this for the first time. And here are a few businesses that we recommend in place of this one.
Oh, they love that. That's such a good idea. Instead of pulling it again, like, you probably have lots of downloads from a 2 to 3 year old episode. You don't, you've got a lot of traction there. You probably have a lot of blog hits and SEO. So that makes a ton of sense. And something I just found out as you were talking about this, I recently just asked Morgan, my podcast my podcast manager, Morgan, hey girl, you're probably listening to this. I recently was like, hey, we have this code out there that's in this episode and it's like not live anymore. And Haylee, same thing. It was like 2 or 3 years old. And I was like, just starting out, we were trying to build the legal page. And I was like, this code can't be there anymore. And I was like, I didn't even know you could go back and edit episodes. It was one of the questions I had because I'm just here recording them, right? Like, I don't need to know that information. And she was like, yeah, you can totally pull things, edit things, and just upload a new file into whatever your podcast host is. And I was like, oh, perfect. Yes. Great. Instead of deleting it. So I love that you brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite things about keeping old content still fresh. And then again, I've run into the situation with podcast codes and especially with show notes. Like I will create show notes for a website or a podcast website. And then years later, if that podcast episode is still live, but that person is no longer using that code or they've completely restructured their website and the links don't work anymore, I run a broken link checker every quarter for all of my podcast clients to make sure that none of the old episode links are broken and that we're not driving people to the wrong places.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, you guys should all go hire Haylee because I need to do that. Putting that in my workflow, Haylee. One of the things, we've all had this, right? So I switched from a big website company to my Shopify website, and it was this huge thing. We did it last June. You guys have had episodes on how I did that and like the process and everything. But one of the biggest things, Haylee, you're right, is links. So we had all these links and then we had all these opt-ins and all these blogs and like additional resources, find here. And it was a nightmare. Everyone had to go through and do all the broken links. So, but in terms of like having guests on the episode, that's definitely something you're going to come up with. That's more of just a really good podcast tip from Haylee. Legally speaking, I don't really think there's any issues. Probably my legal tip there would be in your terms and conditions on your website, you guys, make sure you kind of have an errors and omissions clause that explains there may be errors on the website, i.e. a broken link, and that you will fix it upon, noticing it or upon you, the person who finds it, sending you an email. I'm sure we've all gotten those. I get them all the time. My support inbox and my team is constantly getting like, hey, did you know this is wrong and this is wrong? People love to point out bad things. So just be aware that you'll probably get that. But I would just have a little legal disclaimer, probably an errors and omissions clause is my answer there. Okay, so let's kind of stay on this topic of intellectual property here. I kind of already talked about fair use. The only thing that I would tell people is copyright fair use laws are very complicated. Attorneys spend their entire life litigating fair use. It's constantly changing. It's always in flux. There is case law that comes out that completely reverses precedent from before. So always talk to your attorney if you are this kind of podcaster, which is probably not a ton of people listening in here, Haylee, in our industry, but people who are like giving a lot of commentary or criticism or news reporting or like research. I'm thinking like true crime podcasts, people who are commenting and bashing the Bachelor franchise, so on and so forth. Those are probably falling under fair use laws. But I am positive that those podcasters have a lawyer on hand, basically at all times, because they are probably going to get into more issues with their podcast than other podcasters who are just like sharing, education and knowledge back and forth like we are here. So fair use, you guys, if you ever kind of in that boat of podcasting, just be aware, probably good to talk to a copyright attorney on that who really specializes in fair use. Other than that, I would love to talk about two things here, music and trademarks. I think we should start with music because trademarks I'll just like touch on it a bit. It's a little more complicated and you and I can kind of say like, when would be a good time to like think about it? But I think when you're first starting a podcast, some of the big misnomers is infringing on music copyrights. So can you kind of explain here what you do as a podcast producer to ensure that you're obtaining royalty-free music for ads, for intros, outros, that kind of thing.
Yes. So I offer either I can purchase it on your behalf or you as the podcast host can purchase it, which I typically push for the podcast host to purchase it on their own account so that if we ever split, part ways or I end up moving to a different industry, that they have the ownership of that licensed music, or they have it licensed. Ownership is probably the wrong word there. I'm not the lawyer, but But I end up sending them or encouraging them to go to Audio Jungle or Premium Beat, which are two different royalty-free music libraries. And you can purchase a license to use. It's a standard license, or they also offer premium, but in the podcasting world, a standard license specifically from Premium Beat, because I find more music there that I think my clients will enjoy. Their standard license covers podcasting, and it allows for you to use it and only pay a one-time fee. And it's usually between $50 and $100. So it's not a ton of money for what you're getting. You're getting music that you can use and monetize off of because you're paying for it in that sense of licensing.
Yes. But I mean, you hit everything I was going to say. I mean, you guys, you want to have a limited license to use is usually what it's called for commercial purposes. And so just be literally very wary of being free audio music or free whatever from Google and then just downloading. That's the biggest no-no. And I totally agree with Haylee here. I mean, your biggest thing that you need to do at the beginning is just buy that little snippet of music for a little bit of money. It'll save you so much headache down the road, and it's 100% worth it. Just add that as a little bit of overhead to you starting your podcast, because that amount is that quid pro quo exchange for the limited, assignment of copyright, so to speak. It's not the full assignment. You don't own it, right? You just have the limited right to use that for your podcast or for your business purposes. And you can't sell that to any third parties or, there's always going to be some product usage rights in the contract that you sign when you pay for them. But when you pay it, that is the best thing you can do legally, so that you know that you could own it and use it for your podcast legally. So I'm glad you touched on that. Anything else?
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say is there are a lot of clients that I've worked with that would love to have different music for each of their ads. And so what I always encourage is if you want that, there are memberships and subscriptions to those platforms where you can get multiple files, multiple or different audio clips of different music at a discounted rate if you become a member. So I'm pretty positive. I looked at it the other day and it's $15 per track for 5 tracks a month over 3 months. So, I mean, it's more in the long run of rather than buying one piece of music or licensing one piece of music, you can get multiple and then you have different things for different ads if you wanted them.
Oh, I love that. Again, gonna add that. Morgan, if you're listening to my podcast manager, everyone's like, oh my gosh, Paige, you're ridiculous. But no, seriously, that would be a good idea. We've been, I just get sick of my ad music, the background music. And I'm always telling my editor, can we do a different song? And he's like, well, you got to go buy it. And I'm like, I know. I'm an attorney. But I love this idea. So thanks for bringing that to everyone's attention, because I'm sure you guys will be in that boat someday where you're like, I bought that one song, but now I'm over it. And it's time to have different ad sounds, which is true. And especially when you get into sponsorship, which we'll talk about here in a second, is oftentimes you want to kind of highlight those sponsors a little bit more. And it's nice because if you have regular listeners to your podcast, just in terms of having the sponsor stand out, it's good to use separate music. And sometimes they even have that requirement in their contract with you. So we'll talk about that in a second. But again, just tailing on to ads and music copyright. So that's basically it that you need to know for copyright infringement and royalty-free music. For ads, outros, intros, those type of things. Trademarks. This is something that people ask me all the time. Do I need to trademark my podcast name? My answer is usually yes, if you think that it's going to be larger business asset for yourself, and if it's a really unique podcast name, there is a lot of things you need to consider with trademarking. Sometimes you need to do it at the beginning. Sometimes you just need to wait and see how your podcast does. Before I get into it, Haylee, do you have any scenarios where your clients have either considered trademarking or they've done it right away at all?
So I do. I have a client currently going through the trademarking process for their podcast name because they believe that it will be a very big podcast. But at the same time, there is also another podcast with the exact same name out there. And they've done the outreach to that person who's not planning to move forward with the podcast anymore. Like they've stopped recording episodes. They've moved on to a different name. That's always my biggest thing is research all of the names that you are considering for your podcast to see what else is out there. I'll give one example that I saw happen in like the Bachelor world, since you brought it up earlier, is there is a past a past Bachelor Nation person who wanted to do a show called Wind Down, like WINE, Wind Down.
Oh, yeah, like Jana Kramer's Wind Down podcast.
Yes, she's another one. So it's interesting because if you actually go on and look at Wind Down on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts app, there are dozens of Wind Down podcasts.
Oh, boy.
So one, outside of the trademarking aspect of it, being able to stand out is a huge thing. But then whenever you do find that name that you want to use, also not having someone else come and steal it and trademark it themselves. I'm not the expert here, but I don't know how that works. If I have my podcast and it's out there and then someone else comes in with the same name, can they trademark it? Like that's honestly a question I have for you.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is maybe. You really like started out right, Haylee, where everyone, you just need to go to, like Spotify, right? Type in the podcast name you want. If someone else has it, my best tip would be come up with something different. Like, even if you're in love with it, you don't want to get into that situation where you guys are disputing over names and notoriety. The likelihood of you getting dinged for what's called likelihood of confusion, quote unquote, that is basically a trademark legal concept that says you can't own a trademark to something like a brand name or a podcast name if it's likely to be confused with another business. That it's most important in trademark USPTO, the United States Patent and Trademark Office. It's most important in their world if the podcast has already been trademarked. You can't have the same trademark as someone else, especially if it's already in the podcast domain. So trademarking happens in various sections of industries. And so entertainment and entertainment services is international class 41. And you guys are probably like, oh my God, Paige, stop talking. But the one thing is I will make sure to link in this episode, of course, everything that Haylee has talked about. But I'll also link a really good way for you guys to just click on this link and you can search in the actual trademark database. It's kind of cumbersome and a little old school, so you might have a hard time doing it. But the one thing I would do is just put your podcast name in quotes and then see if anything comes up in IC 41, because that's what you're going to want to click on. If they are already trademarked for a podcast, you're never going to get that trademarked for a podcast. Like there's way too much likelihood of confusion. But examining attorneys, so if you were to submit a trademark, okay, you go to Spotify, you're like, oh, no one has this trademark name. Or like Haylee said, 50 people have Wind Down podcast trademark names. Now I'm going to go research. I'm really interested to see who owns this and if there's multiple people who own it. So I might do follow-up episode here, you guys. But they, if someone does have it, then that's a good time to go look on the USPTO website and be like, they have this name. I still really want it. Is it trademarked? If no, you probably have a better chance of getting it trademarked. So it's not impossible. Even if there is someone else that has a similar business name out there, just be aware that you kind of may have issues with first in use, first in right. So they have some common law trademark ownership over using that name first. And so they could always file an opposition or something along those lines if it is going to create a likelihood of confusion for you owning that trademark. So that's like the simplest version of that is it depends. But I definitely suggest that you reach out to a trademark attorney when you're thinking about trademarking your podcast. And Haylee, I've trademarked dozens of podcast names. So I do so on behalf of clients all the time. They have a really unique name. They want to make sure they're the only one using it. And the best time to do it, you guys, is at the beginning. Because if you're like, I'm going to like save this for down the road, I don't really have the money to do it now. And then you kick yourself a year or two later because someone else finds out about your business name and then they use it. And now they're in the entertainment industry. Maybe they do it for a YouTube channel. Then you're just opening a huge can of worms here. So it's better to do it as soon as possible. But I understand that sometimes like funds and financial means would prevent you from trademarking. But it's definitely something to consider. It's a huge asset for your business. If you think your podcast is going to be really, highly notable and people are going to listen to it all the time, you want a podcast or you want to trademark that podcast name ASAP.
I think I just need to send every client to you that wants to trademark their podcast, because there are some podcast clients that I have that they're not looking to like build this huge platform, but then others are. And the last thing I want is for them to get stuck in some issue where they can't trademark their podcast name, but they could have.
Yeah. And I think that's the answer. That's the simplest answer for, if you're a podcast editor, if you're a podcast manager or producer, always, 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 when you're in trademark world, you shouldn't be giving your clients legal advice on that. There's trademark attorneys that are extremely well-versed in that area of the law. And it's best for you to kind of have some recs on hand, right? You guys probably have editor recommendations on hand. You have all these recommendations of, Haylee, like you said, like where you get music. And it's probably always good to be like, if you want to trademark, like if you're giving that information to them, they probably haven't even thought about it. So you're already doing them a huge service of saying, hey, just something to consider as you're starting your podcast. And then this is who I'd reach out to. So no worries there. That's definitely how I would go about that as a podcast manager, or anyone, of course, if you don't have a podcast manager yet, when you're just starting a podcast and you're like host and wearing all the hats, definitely something to consider.
Absolutely.
Okay, one other thing I wanted to touch on real quick is sponsorships. And I'm interested to kind of hear your take on sponsorships. I don't know if any of the people that you manage their podcast for have large sponsorship companies. But when you guys, if you do get big enough that there's a lot of people who want to pay you to put ads within your podcast, because that is a reality. You can make lots of money from podcasting. And it takes time, right? It's not just going to happen overnight. But when it does, and I'm just going to like manifest that all for you, you want to be aware that you don't just want to have the negotiation go one way. So if sponsors are coming to you, or you're, actually asking for people to sponsor your podcast, just note that that will probably induce a second contract somehow. So, we have our podcast guest agreement. Another thing you need to have in your legal toolkit when you bring on sponsors is a sponsorship contract. So make sure that these kind of explain, of course, who owns the podcast, right? Because they're giving you money to basically sponsor that episode, even though you're only giving them a certain amount of ad space on that episode. That can get really confusing on who owns the copyright ownership if you don't lay that out in a contract. And then how broad is kind of your license to use or talk about their products? Are you only able to do that in that episode? How many episodes can you put it into? Can you go above the amount that they're paying you for? That's kind of interesting, because usually it's like a minimum, right? The sponsors want to pay you a certain amount to put it in 5 episodes over a 5-month period. Okay. Could you do more if like that ends up being a really successful link or people really want it? Those type of things. And then do they have kind of approval rights? That's a big one. Lots of times, you guys know this, if in kind of the social media influencer world, lots of times sponsors who are paying you to promote their products have massive approval rights of what you're posting. You have to like send them the actual story or the post before you post for them to approve. But what is the approval rights with podcasting? You have to think about that too. Do they have to listen to your episode and give you the okay before you post it? Oftentimes the answer is no, not for the whole of the episode, unless it does have to really do with their industry. There could be some move around there, but approval rights probably on the ad itself is going to have to be A-okayed by the sponsor. And then other things that I think Haylee and I kind of mentioned as well is like music. What is the background music for that sponsor? Do they have to pay for it? Are you paying for the, background music? Are you owning the copyright to that, or are they owning the copyright to the music that's in their ad? All of those things just need to be laid out in your podcast sponsorship agreement. So Haylee, I'd love for you to chime in here. What do you guys do with sponsorships? And I'm sure some of your clients are probably at a point too, where if they haven't considered big sponsorships, they probably are because they want to monetize their podcast.
Absolutely. So a lot of my clients are using their podcasts for their own growth of their business, but I do have some now that are in the process of monetizing. And a big thing that I've noticed is advertisers want the podcast to be relevant to their episode. So this is where having a podcast manager or an ads manager of some kind really helps out and plays into this if you do not want to deal with it. And the main reason is it allows for the producer and the manager and the ads manager to also all work together and basically synchronize your schedule to where the right advertiser comes in for the right episode and the right guest. Because while you own the episode, it's always important to, one, make sure that your guest is aware of the advertiser that is going to be on the show, because it could compete with something directly related to their business that they would not be happy about. And that's just one bridge you don't want to burn in the industry, especially when the success of their episode sometimes will rely on their promotion of the episode. And then when it comes to like actually working with advertisers, making sure that they're aware of the awareness that their episode is going to get, or their ad is going to get for your episode. And having those details worked out in your agreement is important. But then also, like you said, knowing how many episodes they want to do it across. And are you looking to monetize per episode, per season, or for a month? So like I've worked with podcast advertisers who want to do 5 back-to-back episodes and bundle it to get a better price. But then it's also great for my podcast host who may not have a full lineup of advertisers. And then they can commit to, I want all of my production paid for and make money off of this show or these 5 episodes with this one advertiser. And here's the cost of that.
Yeah. And I remember you mentioning too that I just wanted to point this out so we don't forget to tell everyone the competition thing is a big issue that I think you have come into play with sometimes. We're not going to go into it, right? We're all being like pretty confidential here. But you had a good really hypo of, say, HoneyBook. A lot of people in our like wedding and event industry use HoneyBook as a CRM. There's, of course, other great CRMs out there, but I used HoneyBook, and HoneyBook is someone like I would consider sponsoring for my podcast if that day ever came. But something that you want to ensure there's no issue or overlap or, of course, competing problems with is what if your guest is like a huge sponsor for another CRM system? Can you kind of explain that a little bit if you've had a situation like that, or just something you would look out for as a podcast manager in that respect?
Absolutely. So one thing that I've seen happen, and I've seen it on other shows too, like that I've not worked on, but I love listening to podcasts. So I do listen to other podcasts, but I've seen where a guest will talk about a certain topic. So staying on topic of a CRM, they'll talk about one that they use, and then randomly in the middle, a podcast will throw in an ad for something, the same product, but a different brand. Whereas they could have worked something out to where it was a different advertisement that was used in that episode so that it didn't compete with that person who was sponsored by the other CRM, because the last thing you want is for the guest to go promote the episode, the advertiser that sponsors them to hear the episode with a different CRM on there. And then that would just create a lot of chaos for their own brand. And that's where you, as the podcast host, you do have the right, like if you use that agreement, you can do that, but it's just best practice not to, and to ensure that it doesn't compete with anything that they're doing in their brand as well.
Yeah. And here it's all about exclusivity, you guys. I didn't really totally touch on this. I've talked about it with sponsorship deals through social media influencers. But the same thing goes for sponsorships on podcasts. Read that exclusivity clause. Understand what their exclusivity is in terms of sponsorship. Oftentimes they will have the exclusivity clause that is benefiting their business to the best of their ability. And then remember, you have negotiating power. So that is one of those clauses. If the sponsorship is presenting you with an agreement, then for your podcast, make sure you're looking at that clause in particular, because they're probably going to have things like that. And if you sign off on that exclusivity, you are in charge of ensuring that you don't breach that by doing some of the things, maybe even accidentally, right? Like non-intentionally, as the person who's putting together the podcast or a podcast manager or editor. Have them on high alert. If you do have a sponsor, be like, hey, this is the sponsor. Just be aware that if we have anything along the lines that are, XYZ that are said in the episode, or alert or probably alert your podcast manager, like, hey, let's just check in that there's no conflicts of interest with this guest. That's a good one. Secondly, I have something to say on the other hand of exclusivity. If you are a guest on a podcast episode, do your research. I firsthand have an experience with this. So they asked me to be a guest on their podcast. We were talking about, of course, something in the legal world, small business wise, that was really poignant and on topic, on trend. People were like asking me for advice on this. And I was like, totally, I'm happy to come on your podcast. But we didn't do our research. And that's just a thing we learn in business. You guys know I'm all about bad things happen. You may have failures. It's okay. It's all about just getting up, learning from your mistakes, and moving forward. And one of the things we learned was they had ads for another attorney, basically like 5 episodes prior to mine. So if you're a very loyal listener on this podcast, you would be so confused. Like, why am I hearing all of these ads? And for me, I was like, this makes no sense. And it really diluted my promotion of myself and my business on my episode that I gave a ton of time and energy to and did back end research on. And then they're just promoting this other attorney prior to me jumping on. So it felt really yucky and icky, and we were able to get it all settled, but I was backpedaling. And you guys, I'm here to be like, this happens in real life. Okay. It happened to me. So with exclusivity, don't just think about it in sponsorship terms, like you sponsoring or having someone sponsor. If you're a guest, make sure you're checking out and just having your team or you in the mornings, do your research, do your due diligence, listen to their episodes and make sure there's no big conflicts of interest that would implicate you and your business and your brand being promoted on their website or their podcast as well.
Absolutely. That's such a good point, because I've seen that exact thing happen multiple times. And even on podcasts that I've worked on, I've seen it happen and it was a red flag, and we had to, go and flag it and say, hey, just want to let you know, we're not releasing your episode for at least another month and a half because this happened, or something along those lines, where we went back to the guest and said, this is our bad. We didn't realize we did this. Let us fix this by doing XYZ.
Oh, and I love that, right? You're taking it from the other side. Yeah, I mean, I just wish they probably would have done that, right? They would have done their due diligence as well and been like, ooh, this is probably a little yucky and slimy, to then have the legal page come on and say all this stuff. And then, of course, they were super open to me promoting things, having freebies for people to download. And then I was like, oh gosh, if I was a listener, I'd be so confused right now. Who do I go to, who do you guys want to support? Like, this is a little confusing. And ultimately, I think that probably looked a little bit bad on their end. It kind of looked a little money hungry. Like they didn't have that person as their guest. They had me instead. And I don't know. I just felt like it was a weird situation. Like I said, we summed it all up. Like everything's fine. But I'm just giving you guys some scenarios here that we all need to think about and be like, oh, if this happened to someone else, it could happen to me. So how can I avoid that? So I'm glad we talked about that, Haylee.
Absolutely.
Okay, last thing before we go is just like a few things about your website. So when you have a podcast, oftentimes you're putting your podcast in your blogs. Haylee, let's just start with like the 411 of best ways to promote your podcast and workflows of getting it on your website.
Okay, so there are a lot of different ways to do it. I will start with that. Every podcast manager, producer, whatever you want to call them, will give you different options. And I kind of leave it up to my client to decide what they want to do with their podcast show notes and promotion. But I always recommend having a place to send all of your listeners that is not on a podcast player, because I've seen Apple Podcast app go down for 4 days at a time. I've seen podcasts get kicked off of Apple Podcasts for a while. Same with Spotify. So I always love to say, take your listeners to your website. Whether you have a website that is for your business and you just want to add to it, I always recommend that because it's great for SEO purposes and you're not trying to maintain two different websites when you don't really need to or want to. So that's the biggest thing, is having a website with show notes. And I always include timestamps and links and descriptions that help people, but then also any freebies that are mentioned in the episode, they can go directly to that podcast show notes section and pull those there. And then as far as getting it on there, you can publish your podcast to a player, embed the player on your website. And some of the podcast embed forms also have a privacy policy associated with it. But I know we've talked about this in the past of having that on your website to cover your own basis, but the podcast player itself will cover a portion of what you need as far as their listenership to your podcast on your website.
Yeah, that's perfect. So essentially, you guys, for SEO purposes, I think a lot of us know this in the online world, put everything on your website, right? You want more traffic than Spotify and Apple Podcasts, even though people are going to go there, right? That's their preferred listening method of podcasts. That's fine. Like, I prefer Apple Podcasts. You may prefer Spotify. That's cool. But when you're promoting it at the beginning and there's like swipe ups and links, you want to have that main hub. Usually it's on a blog, and then you're embedding your little play form from whatever your podcast host is. That is what Haylee's talking about. So you would own the right to the blog post itself. You would own the right to all of your show notes within that blog. You'd own the right to the links if you have additional links, unless, there's an outside link to a third-party website that's like an additional opt-in or a sponsorship or something along those lines. But you want to own the whole copyright to that blog post. Now, here's the trick that Haylee's talking about. Some of those embed codes and player options for people pressing play and listening to your podcast episodes straight from that blog post, where is the privacy policy to that? So in terms and conditions, essentially, to ownership over that actual player and podcast episode. So some players have an additional layer of protection where they say, here is our privacy policy, and there's a clickable link right there in the embedded player itself. And sometimes there's not. I always suggest either or situation. Make sure you have your own terms and conditions and privacy policy in the bottom footer of your website. I've talked about privacy policies and website terms and conditions ad nauseum on this podcast, but here's another reason why you need one. And then probably have a specific podcast clause in your terms and conditions that really explain kind of the ownership of podcasts, that you can't like disseminate that to third parties, and that probably it's hosted on X. If there's a privacy policy to your podcast host, probably link that. So just make sure that you're thinking ahead of time. Okay, it's on my website. So what does that mean legally for that podcast episode, where do I put notice of the rights to that podcast episode? And that's going to be in your terms and conditions and in your privacy policy, especially your privacy policy. If you have any like opt-ins or links that people have to put in their personal information for, that's actually attached to those show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Haylee, we've gone through a lot, but I think all of this was super great information for everyone interested in podcasts, wanting to make sure they have all their ducks in a row, legally speaking, for podcasting. I think the best way to kind of round this all out is to have you, with all of your expertise, tell people in like rapid fire format, if you can, what your best podcast workflow setup is, so that maybe they can take that and implement some of the things, if they don't have it already in their workflow, into their own.
Okay, so to start with episodes, imagine that you've launched your podcast already. We'll start there. When you have a guest on your show, the first thing is you'll want to send over that agreement, but then also getting everything that you need from them. So links, headshots, bios, anything that you're going to want on your podcast, do all of that from the very beginning. And the reason I recommend this is because they may get very nervous after they've recorded their episode and take their sweet time getting you all of the assets that you need in order to get their show or episode published. So I always recommend doing that first, then having the podcast edited, produced, and set up on the back end, which means show notes, graphics, social media teasers, and getting all of that info together and sent over to the podcast guests prior to it releasing so that they can promote the podcast with you. And then scheduling all of it out on whatever podcast host that you have on your website and making sure that it goes up first thing in the morning. And the reason I say first thing in the morning is a lot of people are listening to podcasts on their way to work. As they're getting ready for the day, they want to consume content. So if you're releasing your podcast episode at 6:00 at night, it's likely not going to be listened to until the following day. And if you've already promoted it that day, they're missing out and you're losing out on listeners.
Oh, that was so helpful. I definitely, we always publish ours really early in the morning. And I remember doing it not correctly when I first started out. Just a little tidbit on this, you guys. I think I did it at like 8 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, and it was already like 10 a.m. on the East Coast. And we had to backtrack there because I just wasn't an experienced podcaster. Like, I had no idea when to do this. So that is one thing that I can be like, yep, did that, Haylee, duly noted. I will make sure to implement that in my workflow. And yeah, I think the last thing that I would add on is something that I have learned from podcasting as well. And Haylee, I know you do this with the people that you run their podcasts on, is guest gifts. Just something to kind of really honor the guest and their time and goodwill. And it's really a good way to like continually build that relationship with your podcast guests. Of course, you're kind of having them go through a lot of hoops to get on your podcast just because you want to make sure you're professional, you're legal and protected. They're signing that podcast agreement. They're getting you all these links and headshots. They're probably having to promote as well, right? There's probably a little bit of you are hoping that they will promote on their side of things. That's something the legal page did at the beginning too, is we brought on some really, somewhat notable and popular guests. And I wanted to have them be like, oh, I'm on this podcast just to boost our podcast, right? Like this is normal business practice there. And to honor that, it's really good to continually support them and just give them a little thank you, whether that's like an online gift card or something along those lines. I think it's a really great thing to do. And remember, client gifts and like podcast guest gifts are deductible for tax purposes. So that's always a good thing. Just make sure you kind of stick your logo on it. If you have like a really good kind of package or logo that's definitely coming from your business as a thank you, boom, it's tax deductible. So another little legal tax tidbit for you there. Always a good thing to send that. And it's, of course, going to benefit your business in the long run because you're going to keep friends in the industry.
Oh, yes. And I agree, too, because you're showing them that you appreciate the value that they've brought to your podcast, because in the podcasting world, it's not necessarily normalized to pay guests just because it's not a huge speaking opportunity or a course. an hour, usually an hour or less of just conversation. But it's always nice to show them that little bit of, hey, I appreciate you coming on the show and taking the time for this. So yeah, I agree.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, you guys, I hope you found lots of great value in this podcast episode. Before we leave, you guys know I love to do some like random questions to our guests. I think it's just a fun way to close out these episodes. So Haylee, are you ready?
Totally ready.
Okay. What is your favorite drink of choice right now?
Vanilla Coke.
Oh, that's a good one. What are you munching on snack-wise?
It has always and will forever be white chocolate Reese's Cups.
Oh, yum. Favorite movie of all time?
We are a huge Harry Potter family here, so it is always going to be Harry Potter.
Love it. What's your favorite new song that you've been hearing on the radio?
Ooh, okay. Well, I'm listening to this podcast or this Spotify playlist called Mood Booster, and there's a song from Scooby-Doo, one of the Scooby-Doo movies. I cannot remember the name of it right now, but it is so good, and I don't know why. It's just very catchy.
Oh, I love it. And now everyone can go get that Spotify playlist. Last thing is, what are you binging on Netflix?
Ooh, okay.
Or Hulu or HBO Max or whatever. I got to add them all in there. That's probably rude of me.
Okay. So I think it's on Hulu, maybe. There's a show I just finished last night called 11/22/63. And it's about going back in time and preventing the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I think it's a Stephen King novel. Like it's based on that. And it was so good. Like it's 6 episodes, but so good.
Oh my gosh. I'm going to go put that on my list. Speaking of things you should watch, you guys, this was like rapid fire for Haylee, but I have to add this one in because it's about podcasting. So it's totally apropos for this episode. You guys go watch Truth Be Told on Apple TV. It's with Octavia Spencer and Aaron Paul, and it is so good. It's about basically a true crime podcaster, and she like does the research and like journalism as she's podcasting. It is it's like a mini series too, right? On Apple TV. So there you go. There's a podcast related TV show you can go watch.
I will definitely go.
Yeah, I'm like, put that on Haylee, seriously, put this on your list. All right, Haylee, where can people find you? You've been such a wealth of information. I cannot thank you enough for being on here. And tell everyone where they can find you. And also, are you taking on clients right now? That's what people are probably going to ask.
You can find me at gaffincreative.com or Haylee Gaffin on Instagram. That's Haylee Gaffin, Gaffin. I have a very weirdly spelled name and it's not very common. But yes, I am currently taking on clients depending on when this episode airs. We'll see.
Well, awesome, you guys. Go check Haylee out. You guys know I'm going to link everything and give you all of the Haylee goodies headed your way. We'll make sure to link everything in the show notes here that we talked about as well. And if you have any questions or concerns about podcast legalities, you can always reach out to me at The Legal Page on Instagram or basically anywhere, thelegalpage.com. And then Haylee can probably answer some additional questions for you if you have any like, hey, this scenario happened. What would you do as a podcast manager? Like if you're trying to manage things yourself, I'm sure she'd be able to give you a little bit better advice than I could in that realm. So anyway, thanks everyone so much. Thanks, Haylee.
Thanks, Paige.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Legal Page podcast. See, I told you being legally legit isn't so scary. Be sure to visit thelegalpage.com for all show notes. And it would be super awesome if you could head over to iTunes and leave a review. Last but not least, don't forget to join my free Facebook group for unlimited legal and biz Q&A. Chat soon, Legal Pagers.